Ladies and gentlemen.
You know, in Romania, you say if you are on the corner, you never get married.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm married.
Okay.
It's okay anyway.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Would like to invite you to take your seats. We'll be starting our side event presently. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We are here at COP22 in Marrakesh at a side event on human mobility and climate change, displacement, migration, planned relocation. This side event is a joint United Nations side event of the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, IOM, OHCHR, United Nations University, Unicef, UN Women, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Welcome. We're so excited. Just from that introduction of the organizations that are here, you get a little bit of the pedigree and history of human mobility and climate change in the climate policy process. Over a short period of 5 years, these organizations and many of you have brought the issue of human mobility and the human face of climate change to the discussions here to all of the nations of the world. We're really excited about that. Now that we're in the post-Paris era, and we've come so far, we have a lot more work to do, and I think we're going to hear that from our panelists today. I have just a few brief comments to make about the context of human mobility in the UNFCCC process. Before I do that, I'd love to introduce our panelists. Then I'll make some brief remarks, and then we'll get started. So to my left, and to, well, this, let's see, that'd be your right, my left, we have Marina Frank from the UN Refugee Agency. We have Dr. Robert Oakes from United Nations University. We have Jolene, where am I here? Beg your pardon. We have Joni Pegram from Unicef. We have Ben Schachter from OHCHR. And on the end, we have Dina Ionesco from IOM. To the left, we have Teresia Powell from Fiji, Ambassador Martin Frick from the Food and Agricultural Organization, Atle Solberg of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and then on the end, Nina Birkeland from Norwegian Refugee Council, and we'll be hearing from each one of you in your areas of expertise shortly. My name is Coco Warner. I am with the UN Climate Secretariat, and many of us have been working together for several years on the topic of human mobility and climate change. Let me just give you almost like an unfolding of where we are and where we have to go. If you look at the governance system for human mobility, as well as for climate change, most of the rules governing migration, refugees, and other forms of human mobility came from previous centuries, particularly the 20th century. We've seen in the international and national context a lot of very intense discussions. We have the Syrian refugee crisis. In the news, we've had Brexit, the US elections, in which issues like immigration, like refugees, like complex movement of people really at the very, very highest levels of national leaders' attention. These issues are affecting elections, they're affecting decisions such as Brexit, and. Some of the tensions that we see arising is the discrepancy or this gap between the rules that may have been appropriate in previous centuries, like the 20th century, and the needs of today. We are in a period just a few months ago, half a year or a year ago, when the United Nations family, together with all of the countries of the world, created a series of milestone events. We have sustainable development goals, very high aspirations of leaving no significant vulnerable group behind. in all sorts of important areas: education, maternal health, poverty, distribution of wealth, and. We, of course, have the Paris Agreement, and we have the Sendai framework to reduce disaster risks for people all over the world, contrasted with realities that we're already experiencing on the ground. We have more people than ever exposed to climatic stressors, and some of those are things like earthquakes, which we don't talk about so much here, lots of weather shifts, climate change. We have growing discrepancies worldwide in our economic systems. We have all sorts of poverty traps. We also have many opportunities. But the period that we're in now is a struggle to reformulate the way that we've thought about human mobility and climate change, and making our systems fit for purpose moving forward. And I think those are some of the challenges that we're grappling with out there in the world where all of us work, as well as here in the context of climate policy. That brings me to my final couple of points. In the climate arena, the work under the UNFCCC, under the convention, has several areas where the topic of migration, displacement, and planned relocation feature. All of the work under the Cancun Adaptation Framework, which was launched in 2010, is an area where human mobility comes up. We see countries articulating migration, displacement, and planned relocation in their national adaptation plans, for example. On occasion, the Adaptation Committee deals with the topic. So that's all of this world of adaptation. A little bit more recently, the area of loss and damage has been created here in the UNFCCC context. We have an executive committee for the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. One of their activity areas is dedicated to human mobility issues. So much so that in Paris, the work under the Warsaw International Mechanism established a task force on displacement and migration and other forms of human mobility. So that work is moving forward. Many of you are contributing to that work, and thank you. The last thing that I'd like to say is we have many important milestones, and that's very good. But the real work lies ahead now, and you'll hear this repeated in the post-Paris time. We're looking for new paradigms about complex forms of mobility. We're looking for ways to make action happen on the ground and help people who are both at home as well as on the move, as well as in receiving communities. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here in the room with you as audience members, and of course with our distinguished group of panelists. Thanks to everybody. And with that, we should get started. The first person on our panel today is Marina Frank. Marina has a career track at UNHCR and is very familiar with and a champion of these issues. She's going to be talking with us today about protection challenges and recommendations for addressing displacement. Marina.
Thank you very much, Coco, for this great introduction to this topic and this side event. Displacement is already a current reality, and 1 person every second is displaced by climate-related hazards. But on the other hand, we also have a legal gap to protect these persons displaced in the context of climate change and disasters. For example, the term climate refugee is misleading because in international law, the word refugee describes people fleeing war or persecution and who have crossed an international border. And in the context of climate change and disasters, people that are displaced are actually displaced mainly inside a country. So we prefer using the word persons displaced in the context of climate change. And this is also because of this legal gap that we are part of the platform on disaster displacement, the follow-up to the Nansen initiative that will be also presented by one of the speakers here. And that we are also here at COP22 to do everything we can to avert, minimize displacement before it happens and to address it when people are displaced. In the Paris Agreement, there is a reference to migrant in the preamble. which is great, and which it says that rights of migrants should be respected in any climate change policy. We also think that these migrants should be understood here as broader than just economic migrants, but also people forcibly displaced, the most vulnerable that have no choice but moving, and also the people trapped that have no resources and cannot even move. In the Paris Agreement, there is also many references to the protection of people, the resilience of communities, and the importance of livelihoods. And these are essential entry points for addressing environmentally linked root causes of forced displacement, such as access to water, food, energy, the need of livelihood opportunities to enable people remain where they live. Because that's what people want to do. They usually don't want to be displaced or to migrate. And finally, and importantly, the Paris Agreement creates a task force on displacement. And this task force has a clear mandate, which is to develop recommendations for integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement to the adverse effects of climate change. Related to the adverse effect of climate change. So we, as UNHCR and a lot of other agencies here, are committed to provide support to states and engage in the Warsaw International Mechanism to help develop these recommendations. There's also an important issue under the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is the current 2-year work plan that includes the issue of human mobility, and the next 5-year work plan that we think should also include this issue, to allow the task force to report back to the Warsaw International Mechanism, but also to make sure recommendations from this task force are taken into account and then implemented properly. There are other matters under the UNFCCC that are relevant to human mobility. The Nairobi Work Program, for example, includes an issue on human settlements, which is key to climate displacement. We also encourage, as UNHCR, the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund to take into consideration measures to avert and minimize climate displacement. Because if we want to undertake this work properly and properly address this issue, resources are needed. UNHCR also encouraged the least developed countries expert group to work closely with the task force on displacement, because they have a considerable role to play in averting, minimizing, and addressing displacement. National adaptation plans are also an important vehicle to address this issue, because it is a vehicle that parties can use to prevent and minimize displacement before it happens, by increasing the resilience of communities at risk of displacement. And we also think that more training and capacity building needs to be done on this issue to enable countries to properly address this issue. So I think I won't be long, because we have a lot of speakers on the panel, and I want to allow some time for discussion after this presentation. So don't hesitate to ask us for a policy brief that goes into details of all the issues that I've just highlighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Marina, and thanks to the sound. Dina, we'd be really interested in hearing from your perspective in IOM. You and this group of champions have been supporting the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and we're interested in some of the work that you did, I understand, in Casablanca earlier this year on a technical meeting on human mobility. We're really excited to hear about your update and your ongoing work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Coco. Hello, everyone. to put into perspective the Casablanca workshop that I will come to, I just wanted 1 second that we take stock between 2015 and 2016. It's not much in our life, 1 year, but on the life of how climate migration has evolved, it's a big step forward. And just to remind you, maybe some of you were last year in Paris at our One UN side event. I don't know if you were there. The tension was different. We were with a heartbeat whether migration would be in or not. And finally, it was in. This year, it's very different. It's in. But now it's what do we do with the fact that it's in. So I think this year, it's all about finding solutions and actions that are very concrete on migration and climate. So this explains why throughout the year, there have been a number of actions that have been taken by IOM and by other partners, together with many agencies here present and also civil society and the research, in fact, to move from the policy discussion and the text that was signed in Paris to actual action on climate migration and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So a number of steps have been taken to really move from the text into implementation. From IOM side, I wanted also just to say that we have also taken into account, and you have to read what's going on for the COP22 and what's going on here in Marrakesh on climate migration, also through the perspectives of what's moving on at the migration level. And it's the first time that states have now signed a declaration in New York that deals with migration and refugees and will work together towards global compacts on migrants and refugees. So the action that we are talking about here on climate and migration, it's matched on the other side by action on migration and climate. And I think that's the first time since we talk about climate migration that we have that. And IOM is the first time that we joined, in fact, the UN. It's the first time we speak as a UN also agency. We moved, I think, from the status of cousins into status of sisters or brothers, as you want to see it. So part of these actions, some of them were more focused on capacity building for policymakers. We had one workshop here in Rabat, and part of it was really focused on supporting the implementation of Paris Agreement. So that means also action on human rights and human migrants' rights. It means action also on adaptation, mitigation. It means action on capacity building. It means action, for instance, oceans, land degradation. It means different actions of different entry doors into this topic of climate and migration. But so we also then focused on one of the key outcomes of the Paris Agreement, which is the work of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage that has a work program. Part of this, the EXCOM, the Executive Committee of the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage, has also been tasked to continue and catalyze action on climate and displacement through Decision 50 of the Paris Agreement. So in line with this, IOM in July has brought together, also with specific funding from France, which shows the connection between the French presidency and the Moroccan presidency of the COP, has brought together experts in Casablanca, so purposely in Morocco to prepare for COP22, to take stock of what we already know on climate migration. I think it's extremely important to see that in order to develop the work of a task force on climate migration and climate displacement, the key thing is to take stock of what already is being done by different actors, by states, by civil society, by researchers, by the private sector, at the regional and intergovernmental level. So the Casablanca workshop was workshop contributing to the work of the EXCOM on loss and damage, preparing towards the task force on climate displacement. And what we've worked all together in Casablanca, and I will end and conclude my intervention with this, it's to really bring together what we have, what we know. So all this is available on the Environmental Migration portal, and maybe we can connect at the end and show you where that's, you can download it. It's also available on UNFCCC's website. What we try to do is to think also together, what do we think successful action will look like? If we want to think of climate migration, what we've been working on in 5-year times, what would be successful and how the task force could go towards achieving this success. So we discussed that successful action for us would mean that the needs of vulnerable people are responded to. We also discussed that successful action would mean that people and communities are empowered so that migrants are seen as positive actors of the fight against climate change and not just like the victims. We also consider that successful action means to enable policymakers and communities of practices to secure the funds to act, which is a tiny like clin d'oeil to say the funds, don't forget that it's important to think of human mobility. And successful action would be also that policymakers are enabled to secure means for action and anticipate and act, and also that action is coordinated among actors. So I think we can take out of this that the work is advancing. All this now it's available. It feeds into the WIM XCOM loss and damage displacement work, but I think it goes far beyond it. It's about action on climate and migration, and it's providing also a network of dynamism and activities and collective will to act. And it's also just seeing migration differently, not just like the failure, but also as part of the opportunity to fight against climate change. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Dina. One thing I want to highlight about this collaboration with IOM, and again with so many of you on the panel and in the room, the kind of work that was done before and during the technical expert meeting in Casablanca that the French kindly supported financially along with others, and which IOM kind of curated. This is the kind of innovative partnership-like action that the XCOM is welcoming. So I just wanted to make a little note that if you in your organizations have pieces of work that you would like to do in partnership, please approach either me or XCOM members. We have a team. I'm supervising that work at the UNFCCC formally, but you can also talk to them. We really welcome that. It's a way to bridge the kinds of discussions and issues here in the climate policy with the kind of work going on outside in the real world. So we've really welcomed this and hope that there will be many more collaborations like that going into the future. Thanks so much. One of the interesting aspects of the Paris Agreement, as you know, was featuring in places like the preamble of human rights. So Ben, we're so excited that you've been able to join us to tell us about rights-based approaches to climate displacement from OHCHR's perspective. Please, Ben.
Thank you, Coco, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to speak today on behalf of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. We are living today in an age of mobility. Some 250 million women, men, and children are not living in their own country. Some people are on the move as a result of the impacts of climate change. The majority of them will move within the borders of their own country. Some will cross to neighboring countries. Others will make longer journeys. As is made clear in the recent New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, the causes of these movements are multiple. According to the declaration, some people move in search of new economic opportunities and horizons. Others move to escape armed conflict, poverty, food insecurity, persecution, terrorism, or human rights violations and abuses. Still, others do so in response to the adverse effects of climate change, natural disasters, some of which may be linked to climate change, or other environmental factors. We now know that people move and will move, even crossing borders, rather than face repeated and increasing risks, including risks posed by sudden onset extreme weather events like hurricanes, but also slow onset events such as coastal erosion, acidification, glacial retreat, salinization, sea level rise, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, and desertification. We also know that these movements have human rights implications. Understanding them is one of the more complex and pressing issues currently facing the international community, with an estimated 22.5 million persons displaced internally or across borders by weather each year. Threats faced by those moving as a result of adverse climate impacts are substantial and may be further exacerbated for persons belonging to particular groups, including minorities, indigenous peoples, women, children, persons with disabilities, and the poor. It is widely recognized that the legal and policy regime for protecting the rights of persons on the move owing to the adverse effect of climate change must be clarified in order to adequately address the substantial human rights threats they face, which include food insecurity, lack of access to clean water, healthcare, and basic social services, inability to sustain decent livelihoods, persecution, and discrimination. If these threats are not addressed, we will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, including Goal 10 on reducing inequalities. Failure to address these impacts will leave many people behind. Better understanding is critical. First, it is important to avoid the assumption that migration is always voluntary. Not all cross-border movement falls neatly into categories of voluntary or forced. Today, the various categories into which we have traditionally divided people on the move may be better represented by a continuum. The slowly unfolding pace of some weather-related disasters means that some people might choose to move now before they are forced to move later. Under such circumstances, this movement is not entirely voluntary, and the choices that are exercised are undoubtedly constrained. It is important, in any event, to remember that regardless of their reasons for movement, all persons are entitled to a life of human dignity. We need an approach to climate-related movements, and indeed all human movements, that goes beyond protection from immediate physical threats and looks in addition at the underlying socioeconomic and political context related to poverty and weak governance and the ways in which structural discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion operate to render certain individuals and communities at greater risk of non-voluntary migration or displacement in the context of climate change. Addressing these issues will require us all to work harder to ensure that those who are fleeing across borders receive protection. In October of this year, OHCHR, along with the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice, and the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights and Climate Action, hosted a two-day expert meeting on human rights and climate change. The meeting included a half-day panel and discussion on human rights, migration, and displacement related to the adverse impacts of climate change, which was moderated by Mary Robinson and included expert presentations from OHCHR, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, IOM, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the IPCC, UNHCR, and UNISDR. Some of the recommendations from this rich discussion included the following: address the root causes of forced displacement by strengthening social protection systems, empowering persons in vulnerable situations, and investing in productive, inclusive, and resilient development in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture. Clarify the relationship between climate change and movements of people and the corresponding human rights obligations of states. Address collective displacement and associated human rights harms. Establish mechanisms for impacted people to participate in relevant decision-making, including in discussions at the UNFCCC. Emphasize the importance of preemption through appropriate disaster risk reduction and adaptation, including by taking effective climate change mitigation actions and increasing the resilience of livelihoods and food systems. Further explore the principle of non-refoulement as a complementary framework for the protection of persons displaced by climate change. OHCHR would welcome the task force of the Warsaw Mechanism to consider these recommendations in its deliberations. Further, we believe it is critical that the task force include somebody with human rights expertise in order that the discussion be informed by and integrate human rights. For its part, OHCHR hopes to work to address some of the critical knowledge gaps. In this regard, we have recently joined the advisory committee to the Platform on Disaster Displacement and look forward to work with them and other partners next year to develop a more defined understanding of the human rights risks and vulnerability of individuals and communities who are faced with climate-related disasters, and particularly slow onset events. OHCHR aims for this work to feed into ongoing multilateral and expert processes at the global and regional levels, including the development of a global compact on safe, regular, and orderly migration within the framework of an intergovernmental conference to be held in 2018. State-led processes to develop guidance on vulnerable migrants, ongoing discussions at the UNFCCC related to climate-induced movement of peoples, and efforts to implement commitments made at the World Humanitarian Summit and in the context of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much. I'm sort of abusing my position as moderator to editorialize just a little bit. What I found so interesting, Ben, in your and Dina's presentations is that you're giving us examples how worldwide networks outside of the UNFCCC process, like IOM and your many country offices, and that's the way it is for many of our UN family. We have a lot of things going on in countries across the world. You're bringing in expertise and supporting the work in the climate policy world. Ben, you also mentioned work with champions like Mary Robinson, and of course your high-level people. The spokesmanship and the vision, the messages that you're, and the recommendations that you're giving or that you're targeting towards constituted bodies like the executive committee, that's so helpful. Many of the constituted bodies here have day jobs and they're serving their countries as well as serving this process. And inserting that kind of technical expertise really is valuable in charting this new set of rules or new perspectives moving forward. So that's really helpful. If any of you could follow this example, would be so grateful. It's really appreciated. The third thing that I wanted to mention that Ben highlighted was cross-fertilization across platforms. You may have caught it. Ben mentioned the platform for disaster displacement and their membership in an advisory group. Atli, you may touch on that later. That cross-fertilization of messaging across your networks, to the degree that you can bridge into the climate policy world as well as to the ground level where you have boots on the ground with the people that you work with, that's a key way to actually not just think new things about human mobility and climate change, but actually to do things in new ways. And I think that those are the characteristics of this post-Paris time. We need to think in new ways about human mobility and actually do things in slightly different ways. So thank you so much, and thanks for letting me editorialize. We're excited now to move on to Joni Pegram from Unicef and Robert Oakes from United Nations University, who are going to give us a sense of what human mobility and climate change mean for a particularly vulnerable group of people, namely children, as well as a group whose this is their future. So thank you so much. We're excited to hear some of your research findings.
Thank you very much, Coco. Better, I think. So, as Coco mentioned, UNU EHS are working with UNICEF UK right now to produce this report on particularly how children are impacted by climate change mobility. So I'm going to briefly introduce some ideas, some scientific ideas, we could say, and then I'll pass to Joni, who will address some of the policy side. So, when children move due to the impacts of climate change, they experience a variety of risks, and these risks are both slightly different and perhaps more intensive than adults and others will experience. So children, as we know, are a vulnerable group. So we can say that they're vulnerable because physically, psychologically, emotionally, they are immature and therefore dependent normally on adults, parents, caregivers. when they do move, it could be in terms of displacement, for example, children frequently get separated from their caregivers. So for example, in the Assam region of India, with glacial melt, we can see floods. When families get displaced, the children can get separated from their families, and this can mean that they can be taken advantage of, they can be taken by gangs, sold into forced marriage, trafficking can occur. Okay, so another issue is exposure. Now, in exposure, sometimes we think about geographical exposure. This exposure I want to talk about is just sheer weight of numbers. So children are impacted by climate change mobility globally. So in Alaska, in rich countries like USA, but especially in the global south. And if you think about the population period for the global south, we have a very wide bottom because children make up between 30%, even up to 70% of the population. So it's a really big group which is being impacted. Okay, so there are 6 interrelated risks that we're going to be talking about in our report. I can't talk about them now because we don't have much time, but essentially their health, their water and sanitation, access to shelter, access to education, protection in a kind of broad definition, and their culture and identity are threatened. So in terms of health, I'll just give you a little example. So in Cambodia, they've been experiencing a drought this year. And what's happening is because of the drought, people are less able to produce their livelihoods. They're less able to grow their crops. And what happens is some people are moving to Phnom Penh or even across the border into Thailand to seek other ways to make some income. And what happens in this situation is often that children are actually left behind. So the children are left with their grandparents or other people that care for them in their home villages. And if you're 50, 60, 70 years old, perhaps you don't have the energy, the capacity to properly care for these children. So what we find is these children have impacts on their health, especially nutrition, but other health-seeking behaviors, as an economist would say. So attendance at clinics drops, for example, also. And actually the whole concept of children related to climate change mobility is different to adults, or this kind of wider framing that's been introduced, because some of the terms don't necessarily apply. So Ben mentioned this idea of voluntary migration. So where is this voluntariness for a child? For a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, do they get to choose where they go? Do they get to choose if their parents actually go? Okay, so they might not have this agency involved, make a decision. And so this needs a kind of slight reframing of the terminology that we're using in these processes. Okay, and I'll conclude very quickly. There's this idea of the knowledge gap also. Because of the problems with the terminology, we don't necessarily know what's going on with children. There needs to be a lot more research so we can better inform policy. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to build on that, really, to say that the whole reason that we're working on this report is precisely because children are far too often omitted from the policy discourse in the UNFCCC. And that goes with reference to the adverse impacts of climate change on them specifically, but also in the context of climate-related mobility as well. So we really wanted to shine a light on that. And I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of the human face of what we're talking about here. So Rob mentioned health, but just to build on that, if we're talking about loss of education, for example, disrupted by displacement or migration, is that being considered in the context of non-economic loss, for example, for that child and their future well-being, their future economic and social well-being, particularly for girls? And in terms of malnutrition, for example, leading to irreversible stunting in children, which is low cognitive and physical development, which has obviously a permanent effect over their lifetime as well. How is this being taken into account? And if we're talking about tackling inequality in the context of SDG10 and many of the other SDGs and how we meet those, then we need to consider how these kinds of specific vulnerabilities of children are being consistently and systematically considered, particularly in the context of actions and modes of support foreseen in the context of loss and damage, and in the work of the WIM and the task force. So one of the key recommendations from the report is that we clearly need to have a much more direct information and guidance from the child rights and human rights framework more broadly, and to draw on the wealth of guidance and expertise outside of the UNFCCC in relation to child rights to inform this process. And that will help us to secure effective and sustainable and legitimate solutions. So while it's an extremely welcome step that the Paris Agreement references children's rights, it acknowledges those applying in the context of climate action and intergenerational equity as well, and the rights of migrants, that's an important first step in bringing these frameworks together. But it's important to remember as well that this isn't simply a moral imperative, these are legal obligations. And the UNICEF is the guardian to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely and rapidly ratified international human rights treaty in history. And it's been almost universally ratified by states here, and every country in the world has child rights obligations. So we need to make sure that that's being infused into all of the action taking place in the UNFCCC. Now, concretely, in the context of the task force and the WIM, in addition to the point that Rob talked about in the need for sort of filling in the data gap and the knowledge gap on this, and specifically on children, we want to make sure that the task force and WIM will really build on the expertise outside, as I said. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child is currently doing a lot of work on child rights and climate change specifically, and the environment more broadly, and they're expected to bring forward guidance for states early next year. In addition, the Human Rights Council is also working on child rights and climate change, and an analytical study will be developed early next year too. So how can we bring these processes and this learning to the UNFCCC? You know, could we envisage an expert briefing here? Would that be something that the task force, the WIM, could consider integrating into their work to take expert inputs from these actors? And I hope that that will be a positive step forward. Secondly, something that others have touched on, but the need for a policy response that is very holistic. So that's complex. We're talking about bringing together Paris, SDGs, Sendai, the New York Declaration, and follow-up with the child rights and human rights framework more broadly. And it's not an easy task, but the complex challenges we're facing today do require much more sophisticated responses. So we need to break down these silos. And I think, you know, building with the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights in climate action, I hope will also be involved in this process to bring that knowledge here. Thirdly, that consideration of the best interest of the child is applied as a primary consideration in making decisions that affect them, including in the context of climate-related mobility. Fourthly, that children's right to participate is acknowledged and to be heard in decision-making on this issue. That right needs to be upheld, and that they need to be recognised not just as passive victims, but also as agents of change in their own right that have a valuable contribution to make. And finally, fifth, that they're provided with access to effective and timely remedy for harm. And just to conclude that we will obviously have this report in early next year, and we hope that that will really inform these deliberations as well, because it should capture the experience of children, have some concrete recommendations and examples of best practice, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Joni and Rob, for helping us understand some of the patterns of human mobility and climate change and what that may look like through the eyes of children. We really appreciate that. While Teresa is setting up, just again, an editorial comment, Joni mentioned bringing experts into the process, which is always very appreciated. She also mentioned silos. In the UNFCCC process, we tend to have in terms of breaking down silos or bridging those. It would also be interesting for expert communities to help us understand what you're doing out in the world to increase discussion between relevant ministries, maybe ministries of planning or mayors or countries who might be receiving and countries of origin. So those kinds of silos and what's really going on out there in the world, would really love to hear about that. And if we can also facilitate any of your work, we welcome those recommendations. Teresa, you've joined us from Fiji's perspective, and we're so looking forward to hearing some of your comments about planned relocation as adaptation in Fiji and your particular community, please. Of course.
Move or not move? I can hear that from the plenary on the table. Fiji is already moving in terms of relocation. I'm here to present on a case study on relocation, not to talk about policy, not to talk about any framework, maybe to inform the policy or maybe to inform the framework or also in terms of UNFCCC, or in moving Paris Agreement forward. Our case study is on the relocation of one community in Fiji. So we are already moving. We are not planning, we are already moving. There's other community that needs to be relocated in Fiji. In the maybe our case study on Wundongloa, it's a community in the, we have two big islands. On the other island, where that is where Wundongloa is located. Wundongloa, as you can see in the screen, there's 30 households that already moved, relocated. You can see that on the billboard as well, the stakeholders that also involved in that relocation. Through the eyes of first timer, yes, that is the first community that is relocated in Fiji. To those who don't know where is Fiji, Fiji is in the Pacific, in the South Pacific. I'm sure that if you look through the map, you won't be able to see Fiji. Maybe if you don't want, if Fiji is invisible, because we only have a population of 895,000 made up of islands, and our land area is that small. That's why we are invisible on the map. In terms of Wundongloa, the total population is only 140 with 30 households. Their main source of income is from agriculture, copra, taro, maybe the angona. Those who don't know what is angona, there is a scientific name for that. It belongs to the family, the pepper family. Wundongloa relocation issue came into light during the Cyclone Thomas in 2010. Also, we can see that the impact of sea level rise in Wundongloa, that is the reason that Wundongloa needs to be relocated. Yes, the impact of climate change. You can see that the main reason Wundongloa was relocated because of the impact of sea level rise. In a normal high tide, the whole village is covered up. It's not only Wundongloa, there's other villages in Fiji that needs to be relocated. But the first one is Wundongloa village. Just a way of background, that is where it's been relocated. You can see that they just moved upland. I will explain more when I moved on with my presentation. Yes, that's the old Wundongloa village site during the Cyclone Thomas. Not only that, if you go to the community now, it's more worse than ever. The impact, and also in Wundongloa, there's a river beside it that at any time when it's heavy rain, it's flooded. That is the old site, Wundongloa old site. That community is already vacant. The community already moved upland. Engagement of women in the relocation process. Believe that women needs to be involved in decision making. Participation of women in relocation decision making is very important, especially in terms of risk assessment, or maybe integrated vulnerability adaptation assessment. Women needs to be involved in building and house plan. If a community needs to be relocated, women needs to be involved in that decision making. Location of the new village site, women needs to be there. Not only women, youth and children as well. Also, they needs to be in the decision making, especially in the village and council meeting in terms of the relocation decision. Where they also be involved is on the awareness and capacity building. Women needs to be included, especially at the community, at the subnational, and even at the national level in terms of climate change adaptation and disaster risk management. You can see on that screen the women from Fiji. They went to India, Barefoot College. It's an initiative by the government to send these women to learn about how to implement solar. If you can see from the first slide, you can see that Wundongloa lit up. There is solar system that was implemented and done by the lady from Bundangoloa, Pitilia Samida. So they have to be involved in capacity building. They have to be included in the capacity building or even training. For the reason that in terms of sustainability, women are in the village. They are the ones that will be implementing and see that the project is sustainable. Yeah, I already explained that. There is one of my colleagues sitting in front here that helped the women in the implement the project in Bundangoloa. Leadership role. I believe women needs to be included, lead in relevant existing forums or committee at the village and provincial level, contributed to community development plan. If women is not included in development plan, then I can say that that project won't be sustainable. We have to hear the view of women, youth, and children as well. Lead in implementing community projects. Socio-economic activities, women needs to be included. In the Pacific perspective, they need to be included. In terms of culture and traditional, these are the aspects that can build resilience and also adaptive capacity in terms of the impact of climate change. In that screen, you can see that there is another project, another village in Fiji that's partially relocated with the involvement of AIDS and also the government initiative. The success of relocation in Bundangoloa, was the willingness of the people of Bundangoloa that they need to be relocated. They also contributed in kind, the involvement of the church. There is no hosting community involved. That means they are moving to their own land. That means that make it successful because there is no issue of land system. The availability of assistance from the government. It's more as an integrated approach where the community, government, civil society, non-government organization, they were already also involved. In terms of moving, I can say that it's also successful because the whole community moved at one time. And when they move to their own land, as I alluded earlier. That I believe that was a cause of one of the reasons it was a successful relocation. I won't touch more on this, but government intervention is important in terms of location or in terms of moving a human being. Where the line ministries, you can see that on the agency column, that is where all the line ministries in Fiji are involved in terms of the relocation. Just a flow of the relocation in Bundangoloa. The government makes sure that when this community are relocated, their livelihood aspect as well has to be taken care of. Challenges. I'm almost finished. Key challenges, there's less vocal communities, especially women, that experience adverse climatic and environmental changes to have the opportunity to voice their needs or even their requests. Lack of financial resources for relocation costs and equity in their distribution. I believe that relocation is very expensive, not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of their social aspect, cultural aspect, spiritual aspect is also affected. Recommendation, I'm almost there. Should develop consistent and rigorous process for assessing and monitoring climate vulnerability and risk. It should be an integrated approach. Identify and acquire suitable alternative allocations, especially when you move a community. Respond to social cultural preferences to remain as a cohesive community in order to preserve existing social and cultural aspects. Relocation should be thorough and very slow. Set up a clear institutional framework and processes for relocation planning, implementation, and completion for the reason that there should be a structure in place. Lesson learned from Bundangoloa relocation, there was no relocation guideline. So now Fiji into its draft relocation guideline, and it should be hopefully by the end of this year or early next year that Fiji should have a relocation guideline. Lesson learned from Bundangoloa relocation. My last bullet point there, relocation should be the last climate change adaptation option. Conclusion, my last slide. The project brings a new life, even though there was challenges, even though we faced a lot of difficulties in terms of funding that was coming very slowly. Like I said, it's a very expensive process, but it brings new life to the people of Ndongoloa. It provides more socioeconomic opportunities for the women and youth, and providing easy accessibility to the children, and also the elderly in terms of essential services. Pinakabakalewu, and thank you.
Teresa, I think this is this presentation of your experience in Fiji exemplifies some of the new practices, or maybe not new practices, but the characteristics of practices in this century. You see all the many different kinds of ministries that need to be working together, and particularly the roles of different groups of people, women in communities. So I think that really gives you're carrying a torch that helps illuminate the path ahead of us. Thank you so much. We're moving on now to Martin Frank, who is leading some of the climate change work at the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. Martin, we're so glad that you're here on our panel today.
Thank you very much, Coco. And I would answer you if this thing would work. No, it doesn't. Now it's working. Okay. Thank you very much, Coco, and I'm happy that I don't have to act as loudspeaker and that the microphone works. You said at the outset that this is a question of the human face of climate change. And I would say today, if you look into the human face of climate change, what you see more often than not is actually a farmer. We still have today 795 million people, which we estimate to be food insecure. And the absurdity of it is that the large majority of the people who are food insecure are actually farmers themselves. The poorest of the poor are still, despite the big trends to urbanization, in the countryside, and they are trying to make a living on a small piece of land. Second observation, if we speak about leaving no one behind in the SDGs, we have to take stock of a situation in which people are being left behind. And the people who are being left behind are very often women and children. Because if the pressure on a piece of land augments to a point that it becomes clear that this is not leading into the future, it's mostly men, and mostly young men, who leave the countryside and go firstly to the city. I think in the first intervention we have heard about the enormous phenomenon of internal migration, which we don't really count in, but this is where it starts. And then in a second wave, we see some of these men mostly emigrating to other countries. So in order to reverse it, we have to start where the problem starts. And this is in food and agriculture production upstream. Let me give you a number. We have 1.3 billion people worldwide who are living directly on agriculture. So agriculture by far is second to no other sector when it comes to employment. Let me give you another number. We are here on the African continent. On this continent, from now until 2030, we have every single year 11 million young people additionally entering the labor market, and they are seeking an employment and they are seeking a future for them and their prospective families. We have to answer that, and we have to go back to the sector that supplies most of the jobs worldwide, and that is agriculture. But agriculture is massively hit by climate change. There's a basic and simple equation saying the poorer you are, the more directly you depend on the natural resources around you. When you're running out of water and you don't have money, you just can't buy bottled water. It's as simple as that. We see the impacts on agriculture, of course, in dramatic events like tropical storms, droughts, heat waves. But what we don't see, and what might be just as dangerous as the extreme events, is the slow onset changes in agriculture, where farmers often question themselves, now is that just another bad year? Will next year be better? Can we still hope? Or is that an irreversible trend turning into something that makes living impossible? And bear in mind that in order to adapt, in order to change the way you're doing your business, you always need a bit of money and resources so you can invest into something new. The world's poorest do not have that. Once the climate fails you, the weather fails you, and you don't have a harvest, you're basically out of business. You only have this one possibility. A disclaimer, when I speak about agriculture, in our Food and Agriculture Organization sense, we also mean fisheries and we also mean forests, which are indispensable for food production. And we just heard from you about Fiji, where fishing is a big part of the income. Again, a number. We have 250 million people worldwide who directly depend on fisheries. And as you can easily imagine, the poorer you are, the more simple your methods of catching are. So the poorest are really depending on coastal fisheries. But climate change is warming the waters, and the fish stock is moving to different, deeper waters where poor people just simply do not have access. But there's also good news. In agriculture, it's relatively simple to turn around the tide and to work in more adapted strategies. And this is because for many decades, we have been focusing on increasing production only, neglecting basically the ecosystems and the complex mechanisms around a piece of land. And as a colleague of mine rightfully said, we didn't do agriculture. What we did was actually mining. And as a result of that, soils were, for example, depleted worldwide. And the soil crisis, for me, is the biggest untold story on this planet currently, since we finally came to the recognition of climate change. Despite latest political trends, I think intelligent people around the world know that it's happening and know that it's man-made. Same is true for the loss of agricultural soils. Now, let me come quickly to the solution. The solution is not difficult, but it is difficult at the same time, and I will explain. To do the right thing in agriculture, basically what you need to do is not to press the last bit of productivity out of any square meter of land that you have, but leave space to biodiversity, leave time to basically regenerate soils, change crops, move away from monocropping. Often farmers can't do that because, again, they're living on the edge and they need to survive year after year. So what we need to change is our perception of actually what a farmer is. A farmer is not somebody who is only working on a piece of land to gain revenue from producing food. If she's working on a piece of land, she is also providing, and I'm saying she because in most of the African countries it's women doing farming, she's also providing services that keep the entire ecological system of this planet alive. If he or she, let's be gender balanced, is working on improving the soil carbon content of soils, this is also an act of sequestering carbon. But most importantly in water-stressed countries, it is improving the capacity of soils to retain water. So let me come to my conclusion. Firstly, we have to pay much more attention to what's happening upstream if we really want to speak educated about migration. We need to avoid polemics and we need to see what actually is happening early on. We need to factor in that people don't like to migrate. People have a relationship to their piece of land. And you mentioned, and I was very happy you did, the spiritual dimension of it, the cultural dimension, and the heritage. I mean, people depend and they want to stay where they have lived and where their ancestors have been living. And we need to do away with this notion of voluntary migration. It's not voluntary. Secondly, we need to see the opportunities. And in the ag sectors, little investment in money, little is relative, but little investment in money can actually help trigger an enormous global employment program, can start fast start action, which is urgently needed in the climate change world. Just to mention that many of the emissions coming from agriculture are actually methane emissions, and they can be addressed quite simply by reducing, for example, post-harvest losses, or in many of the developed countries, food waste. Thirdly, investing money wisely. We don't have extra money to spend on every single SDG and on climate change and on mitigation and on adaptation. Investing into smallholder farmers is clever investment, not only because your dollar basically brings multiple returns, but also it's a question of climate justice, because the people you are addressing are the ones who contributed least to climate change. And lastly, and Coco, I'm coming back to what you just said in your last moderation, we need to see the full pictures. We have really to break down the silos. And I'm happy that this particular conference of the parties is finally giving the agricultural sectors a big platform and to showcase what they can do to be part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin, for your leadership and your clear messages. Atle, for the past few years, you've been involved in platforms and in reaching across regions of the world to make these kinds of connections that Martin and others have been discussing. Excuse me. We're really looking forward to hearing about this relatively new platform and your efforts in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Coco, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Atle Solberg, and I work for the Platform on Disaster Displacement and represent the platform in this event. The platform is a state-led initiative and is currently under the leadership of Germany. I would like to recognize the partners in the panel, in particular the High Commissioner Refugee organizing it, but also the government of Fiji. When the Platform on Disaster Displacement was launched under the World Humanitarian Summit in May, we had the pleasure to count on the presence of your Prime Minister, Bainimarama, and Fiji is also a member of our steering group, so I want to recognize that. I'll try to talk about three things within the time allocated to me. I will talk a little about people that are displaced in the context of climate change and disaster. That is a subcategory, or that is more narrow than the entire human mobility, the human mobility aspect of human mobility in the context of climate change. Then I will explain the process around the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is a state-led initiative trying to address some of the challenges we have heard already in the panel, but it's also counting on a multi-stakeholder involvement. And I'm very happy to see that many of our partners in the advisory committee of the platform that support states are also part of the panel. And then finally, I will say a few words about what can we recommend to parties to the convention, and why is it important to also talk to the climate change negotiator. So first, let me just situate the Platform on Disaster Displacement. What we are referring to are those that are forced to flee or obliged to flee in the context of disaster caused by natural hazards, either of a geophysical nature, such as earthquake, but also weather-related hazards, such as tropical storms. We know that about 20 to 30 million people are displaced annually in these contexts. And we have some recent examples. For example, the Hurricane Matthew on Haiti that hit the island and generated large number of displacement. And earlier this year, we had tropical cyclone Winston on Fiji that also generated huge number of displacement. So that is one context where people are displaced. And the second context, which is a bit harder to conceptualize, are those displacements taking place in the context of slow onset events, such as rising sea level, desertification, or glacier melting. And these movements, as some of my colleagues has already mentioned, may be forced, that people are left with no choices than to move. And that is, in our understanding, disaster displacement, in the sense that it generates a specific type of protection concerns due to its forced nature. When such movement, or when such displacement is cross-border, it generates another set of problems, because there's very little in international law that will provide protection to people that are that are displaced across border. When such movement is permanent, people cannot go back. Normally, people are able to return back after a sudden onset disaster, but when people cannot return back because of the hazards or the risk of repeated hazards, that also generates a specific protection challenges. And our colleague from Fiji illustrated that quite well. And thirdly, it's also when people are moving in groups or when an entire nation will have to move. Then we are set for some specific challenges. So this is the scope within which the platform is organized. This brings me to the second point, which is to explain a little the state-led process of the platform on disaster displacement. It builds on something called the Nansen Initiative that was launched by state in 2012. And these were a group of states that wanted to look into the legal gap that exists in international law for those that are displaced across international border in the context of disaster and climate change. And the outcome of that process of the Nansen Initiative launched in 2012 was the protection agenda for the protection of people displaced across border in the context of disaster and climate change. And I cannot go very much into that agenda due to time constraints, but I'd be happy to stay behind and explain it. I also have some copies of the protection agenda. And it's essentially a policy document that suggests some effective practices states and others can do to reduce the risk of displacement, but also how to address it when displacement is a reality. It has a set of recommendations around managing risks, but also a set of recommendations how states can admit and let people stay if they have to cross international border. And the protection agenda was endorsed by 109 states, so it has strong support by states in terms of its implementation. And the implementation of the protection agenda is the reason for launching the platform on disaster displacement. As I mentioned, it was launched in May this year during the World Humanitarian Summit. It counts on 15 member states, including Fiji, as mentioned, and it's led by Germany and Bangladesh as vice chair. And very importantly, there is a structure of an advisory committee, and all UN agencies present at the panel are member or can be member of that advisory committee. And we also count on membership from regional organizations, civil society, and academics. That brings me to the third point, which is why do we engage with the climate change negotiation? The protection agenda and the Nansen Initiative departed very much from the Cancun Adaptation Framework, paragraph 14F, which called for states and parties to enhance understanding, cooperation, and coordination around climate-induced migration, land relocation, and displacement. So the protection agenda is very much an answer to that call. And the protection agenda very much welcome both the Cancun Adaptation Framework, the Doha Decision on Loss and Damage, and more lately the Paris Agreement. Because we have two tools, particularly in these instruments. One is how adaptation measures can be used to reduce risk of displacement, but also how adaptation measures shall be linked to managing mobility, such as migration as an adaptation method. It also clearly fleshes out or outlines that displacement is loss and damage, and it is to be dealt with as a loss and damage issue. And that's also some opportunities coming out of the Paris Agreement and the COP21 decision. And these instruments will allow us to find options that can be used to reduce risk of displacement, look into mobility issues as an adaptation measures, how to plan for relocation within an adaptation and risk reduction framework, and also to find solutions, as we also saw from the example from Fiji. We believe that the platform with its partner and states membership can provide a set of recommendations or help the task force under the Warsaw International Mechanism to develop recommendations on integrated approaches, how to avert, minimize, and address displacement. And we have a set of technical, i.e. about knowledge, technical recommendation we can share. We have operational findings. We know we can tap into experience or effective practice around operational issues, how to deal with mobility and displacement in the context of climate change. And there's also financial and normative recommendation that we would like to share with the Warsaw mechanism and its task force to be established. So, Madam Chair, thank you so much for attention. Over to you.
Atle, thank you so much. We really benefit from your ongoing engagement and those helpful inputs. Thanks. Last but not least on our panel is Nina Birkeland from Norwegian Refugee Council. Some of the great information about displacement and some of the really nice infographics that you might see floating around on Twitter, for example, come from some of the work that Nina's involved in, among other things. Nina, we're excited to hear you talking about climate change and displacement in the Horn of Africa, particularly in Ethiopia.
Who saw the flyer before coming here know that there's another person who should have been here. It's my colleague Mo Hassan, who works in Ethiopia. He's Somali himself, and unfortunately he couldn't come, so we agreed that I will try to give the presentation on his behalf. But also, why do we as the Norwegian Refugee Council engage in this at all? I mean, we've been working on refugee issues since 1946, traditionally people fleeing from conflict and violence. But what we have seen over many years and also engaging with the UNFCCC is that the effects of climate change, but also natural disasters, is actually already today causing much more people fleeing and being displaced than conflict. We heard some of the figures already from Atle and other colleagues here. Marine referred to that every second one person is displaced by slow onset disasters. We still don't have good enough methodologies to come up with good figures on this slow onset, but we know that those are going to be much larger. So maybe the title of this shouldn't be the gathering storm, but the storm is not only gathering, it's really a storm already, and it will just grow unless we do something. The Norwegian Refugee Council, we work with policy work and trying to influence processes like this, but even more importantly in many ways is that we have projects in countries and we work where people are exposed to displacement and displaced. We also run a roster of people who can be deployed as experts to governments, UN and others. When we prepared for this presentation, we very much wanted to look at Ethiopia as an example. Ethiopia is a country where there is a lot of good policy work in place. There is actually funding available, not in a situation where you have quite a lot of things going well, but still displacement is large. Let's see if I can do this at the same time. So in Ethiopia, the country has a population of close to 100 million people. And from what we know, and we know that this is not everyone, but we know that at least 1.3 million people are living as displaced within Ethiopia. These are refugees from other countries, and those who are displaced inside their own country, the so-called internally displaced people. When we look at the IDPs, the internally displaced people, that's about 600,000 of this number. And when we look into those 600,000, we see that 87% of those, their displacement is triggered by the adverse effects of climate change. And the last, it's not kind of the classic old conflicts, but it's conflicts linked to resource depletion. So again, linked to climate change. So in a country like Ethiopia, people today, but what will be the future? We know that Ethiopia is recovering from the worst drought, the El Nino, and also overall the threats by climate change are large. In this presentation, we won't look at the whole country, but look at one region. It's the Somali region, which for those who know Ethiopia well knows where it is, but for many, maybe not. It starts north, bordering Djibouti, along Somalia, and all the way south to Kenya. And in this region, there are more than 5 million people living. We already heard about the importance of agriculture, within this group, 70% lives from livestock as their main livelihood. Subsistence agriculture, 15%. And what we have seen over the years is that the changes in rainfall patterns are related to droughts. The frequency and intensity of these droughts have increased, and it's not just causing displacement directly linked to the floods, to the droughts, but also the conflicts that arise over depletion of resources. So in this presentation, we'll try to look at the two and also how it interacts. In the region, a little bit outside the capital of the region called Jijiga, you have an area called Anod. And in this region, quite a few people have recently been displaced. And I will read very briefly the story of an older woman, 84 years old, who fled from Makare Voreda. She came from the Urima state and she fled into another state. And she had now been living for 5 weeks in a site for displaced people. And she found the life there very difficult, and there were very few of the basic needs covered. In the previous life, she had used to grow maize and cut, and also had some herd of cattle. And the shop in the village provided all that was needed by the family, and she could share with her children and extend the family. She tells, recurrent droughts led to constant expansion of the Romos into our farming area. And most of the men in her community were killed, and once they started torching the houses, they had no option but to seek a place of safety. She's very happy to be in this other region where she can be with other Somali-speaking people who are then in charge of trying to assist and help, and she has no intention of going back at the time of this interview. What this brief story shows is how the pressure arises from multiple angles. It's the loss of traditional livelihoods, it's compounded by the limitation of alternatives, people's lack of skills, eroding confidence in what is available in the surrounding, and the bleak outlook is completed by limited investment in education and capacity development. So the choices for the community and for the individuals are very, very few. And they build on the few available resources and the knowledge. So as the pressure mounts, community could start to move, and here I use deliberately the word move. We wouldn't necessarily call it displacement of first movements, but what we see in this region is that movement by movement become into a situation where we definitely need to use the label displacement. It's not by any choice any longer, so we talk about displacement. The figures here, we don't know exactly, but they are large. We already heard a bit about the children and how the importance of recognizing all the different people in the community. So one of the things we think is very important for the work of the task force as it moves ahead is not only take the kind of global knowledge and the policy coherence and all of this, but really link it to the concrete experience of communities, of the people inside the community. So children, women, older men, you can make many different groups within groups, but really go to the community level. And this is somewhere we as NRC hope to be able, go back. We as NRC hope to be able to contribute with the experience we have through many of the country programs we have. I'll skip the next slide, Atlas. You can just jump one ahead because time is very short. What we as seen here that the drought now happens every 2-3 years instead of once a decade. There's no time to come back, bounce back, build back. Also, very often displacement has been dealt with as a humanitarian issue. So you only look at kind of keeping people alive and address today's needs and not look into the future and prevention. And this is a huge opportunity we see with the work within the task force of the WIM is the focus we hope that task force will have on prevention of displacement. What we see in the Somali region in Ethiopia is the shocks hits before community recovers, and it leads to a total distraction. And disaster risk reduction is imperative. So again, linking to other policy frameworks like Sendai. No, move on. No, thank you. Sorry. Back. Press myself. When we look on climate change displacement in relation to conflict, what we have seen in Ethiopia, but also other countries we work, is that the limited alternative to livelihoods means that people are very much at risk of moving into a conflict situation when you lose this livelihood. And as I said, people start moving, and this leads eventually also to people moving into other people's areas. Violence breaks out, and displacement happens. So again, displacement linked to conflict, driven by climate change, but also direct displacement. Then you can move on, Atle. What we have seen in this area is that how do people try to use the existing strategies they've had for many years? How can you use the different links between clans? Are there options to diversify your livelihoods? And what people see is that you kind of try to diversify, but you reach a point where you can't any longer do it. And for many people, it's going to the big town urbanization, which is seen as the choice. And then from there, many people say, well, Europe, America is where we have options. In the same region, there has been established what is labeled relief sites, IDP sites. Some people will call them camps, different names, but a location where people can get support. But this is, of course, very much band-aid and not really finding solutions. Urbanization, and also people talk about the smuggling to the Gulf or to Europe, and the despair is absolute. What we hope to be able to do through our programs working with the communities here is to really look at and try to identify what are and who are the communities at risk. Work with disaster risk reduction and community-based early warning system to help communities to not get into this very desperate situation. We want to be able to work with the strengths and weaknesses within the community and implement community-led alternatives, and focus very much on displacement prevention. We're trying to take learning from a program we had in Somalia, where we were able to get funds from two donors, DFID and ECHO, that were not only giving humanitarian money, but also trying to build resilience. I know time is very much getting to an end, so Atle, you can press the last slide. So our three key messages here is, first of all, we need to link the global policy and the community experience. And I think in this room, many people can help to do that, but also how do we do this in a systematic way to the task force? We want to acknowledge that small movements becomes mass displacement, but this also gives both communities and anyone, whether they are governments and others, gives a time to respond. You don't need to wait to the big mass, you can start working when you see this is happening. And finally, focus should be on prevention and resilience building. Thank you.
Nina, thank you so much. That was really insightful. One of the things I've really picked up from yours and other presentations is when we're talking about climate change and human mobility, we have a system, and we need to reduce and avert undesirable impacts on vulnerable people, but we also need contingency planning. And that doesn't necessarily fit into the kind of siloed, boxed thinking of the past. We need new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things. This has been a really exciting panel, lots of rich information, and the time has flown. I'd like to especially thank UNHCR for bringing together this wonderful panel and side event for all of you, and especially for you, our audience members. Our time is spent, and because we want to respect the next people who are coming, would like to invite those of you who want to continue conversations out into the corridors for more interaction, questions, and exchange of experience. Thank you, everyone. Good luck with your important work here in Marrakesh.
It's really,
Nina, you mentioned Nina.
it's really linking the different. Thank you so much.
And it's really structured, but it's really, it's really interesting. You have been 1 month.
I know that. What's really awesome.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much. That was true. At least someone is having a competition here. For us, but yeah.
But it might
Again?
yes, that would be great.
Are you calling on tonight? I have to pay back. But his birthday, he told me, I didn't know. So I would like to join if, do you know there's a local cafe?
I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
I walk by everyone. It's the main screen. Yes, I'm sorry. I cannot say.
Sorry.
Good. Okay, so